The sun hung like a bronze shield over the Arizona territory as John Mackenzie wiped the sweat from his brow and surveyed his modest ranch. It wasn't much, a weathered barn, a small corral, and a house built from whatever lumber he could salvage, but it was his. After years of drifting from one mining camp to another, he'd finally found a place to call home in this unforgiving desert landscape. It was the summer of 1877, and the Apache Wars had turned the Southwest into a powder keg. Most ranchers had already abandoned their homesteads, fleeing to the safety of military forts or heading back east. But John was stubborn, perhaps foolishly so. He'd invested everything he had into this land, and he wasn't about to let fear drive him away. On that particular afternoon, as the heat shimmered off the rocky hills, John was mending a section of fence when he heard it, a faint sound that didn't belong to the usual chorus of desert life. It was labored breathing, punctuated by soft whimpers of pain. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning against the fence post, but curiosity won over caution. Following the sound, he made his way through a cluster of mesquite trees to a dry creek bed. What he found there made him freeze in his tracks. Lying in the shade of an overhanging rock was a young Apache girl, no more than 16 or 17 years old. Her breathing was shallow, her lips cracked and bleeding from severe dehydration. Her buckskin dress was torn, and her feet were badly blistered. It was clear she'd been traveling for days without water. Every instinct told John to walk away. The Apache had raided settlements throughout the territory. Just 2 months ago, they'd attacked a ranch 30 miles north, killing everyone they found. Helping an Apache, even a dying girl, could be seen as an act of treachery by his neighbors, if word got out. But as he stood there, looking down at the suffering girl, he saw only a human being in desperate need. His late wife, Sarah, who died of fever 3 years prior, would have been ashamed of him if he walked away. She'd always said that mercy was what separated civilized people from savages, regardless of which side of the conflict they stood on. John returned to his house and filled his largest canteen with fresh water from the well. He also grabbed some dried beef, bread, and a blanket. When he returned to the creek bed, the girl's eyes were closed. For a moment, he feared she'd already passed, but then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest. Kneeling beside her, he gently lifted her head and brought the canteen to her lips. At first, she didn't respond, but then her survival instincts kicked in. Her eyes fluttered open, dark as obsidian and filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. John had to pull the canteen away to keep her from making herself sick. The girl spoke in Apache, words he couldn't understand, but her tone was pleading. John offered her the food, which she accepted with trembling hands. As she ate, he noticed a serious wound on her ankle, already showing signs of infection. Without asking permission, knowing she wouldn't understand anyway, he cleaned the wound with whiskey from his flask, then bandaged it with strips of clean cloth. Throughout this process, the girl watched him with those intense dark eyes, clearly uncertain whether he meant to help or harm her. When he finished tending to her wound, John stood and gestured toward his ranch house in the distance. The girl shook her head violently, fear flooding her features. She clearly had no intention of going anywhere near a white man's dwelling. John understood. He left the blanket, the remaining food, and the canteen beside her. Using simple gestures, he made it clear she was free to go or stay as she wished. Then he walked back to his ranch, feeling her eyes boring into his back the entire way. That evening, he checked the creek bed. The girl was gone, as he'd expected. The blanket and canteen were also gone, but that was a small price to pay for a clear conscience. John returned to his house, ate a simple dinner, and went to bed thinking nothing more of the encounter. He woke just after dawn to a sound that made his blood run cold. The thunder of hoofbeats, hundreds of them, echoing through the valley like an approaching storm. John grabbed his rifle and rushed to the window. What he saw defied comprehension. His ranch was completely surrounded. Warriors on horseback filled every hillside, arranged in precise rows that created a natural amphitheater around his property. They sat motionless on their mounts, faces painted for war, rifles and lances gleaming in the morning sun. John's hands shook as he tried to count them. 100, 200, more. There had to be at least 300 Apache warriors encircling his small ranch. This was it, he thought. This was how he would die. They would burn his ranch to the ground with him inside it, or perhaps they'd allow him to step outside only to fill him with arrows. He thought of Sarah, wondered if he'd see her again soon, and tried to make peace with his fate. But minutes passed, and nothing happened. The warriors simply sat there, watching. The silence was more terrifying than war cries would have been. John's mind raced, trying to understand what they were waiting for. Perhaps they were toying with him, letting fear do its work before the final attack. Then the circle of warriors parted, creating a pathway from the hills down to John's front door. Through this opening rode 3 figures. As they drew closer, John's confusion deepened. The rider in the center was clearly a chief or leader of great importance, his bearing radiating authority. To his right rode another warrior, younger but equally formidable. And to his left, sitting tall on a painted horse, was the girl John had helped the day before. The 3 riders stopped just outside John's fence. The older warrior, clearly a man of immense status, raised his hand in a gesture that seemed to indicate John should come outside. With his heart hammering in his chest, John set down his rifle, opened the door, and stepped into the morning light. The chief began to speak, his voice strong and clear. Though John couldn't understand the Apache language, he caught occasional Spanish words interspersed throughout. The girl, looking far healthier than she had the day before, also spoke, gesturing toward John and then to herself. She pointed to her bandaged ankle, then to the canteen hanging from her saddle. Gradually, understanding dawned on John. The girl was explaining what had happened, how John had found her dying of thirst and exposure, how he'd given her water, food, and tended her wounds without expecting anything in return. The chief listened intently, occasionally glancing at John with an expression that was impossible to read. When the girl finished speaking, the chief was silent for a long moment. Then he dismounted and walked directly toward John. Every muscle in John's body tensed, but he forced himself to remain still. To show fear now would likely be fatal. The chief stopped an arm's length away and studied John's face with piercing intensity. Then, slowly and deliberately, he extended his hand in the white man's custom of greeting. John grasped it, and they shook, a bridge spanning 2 worlds at war. Through a mixture of Spanish, Apache, and gestures, the chief made his intentions clear. The girl John had saved was his granddaughter, the daughter of his deceased son. She had been separated from her people during a skirmish with cavalry soldiers and had wandered the desert for 3 days without food or water. When she hadn't returned, the chief had mobilized his warriors to search for her, fearing the worst. When she'd made it back to her people the previous evening and told them about the white rancher who'd saved her life, the chief had been skeptical. White men, in his experience, showed no mercy to Apache, just as his people showed none to them. It was the way of war. But his granddaughter insisted, showing the bandages, the food she'd brought back, the canteen with water still in it. The chief had decided to see this unusual rancher for himself, bringing his warriors not to attack, but as an honor guard. Among his people, a life debt was sacred. John Mackenzie had saved the most precious thing in the chief's world, the last link to his beloved son. For this, the chief wished to extend his protection. Through his halting Spanish and the girl's translation, the chief made John an extraordinary offer. As long as the chief lived, no Apache warrior under his command would raid John's ranch or harm him in any way. More than that, any Apache who saw the mark the chief would give him would offer aid rather than violence. It was a guarantee of safe passage through Apache territory, something no other white man possessed. The chief produced a small leather pouch and withdrew a necklace made of turquoise stones and a silver medallion inscribed with Apache symbols. He placed it around John's neck himself, then spoke words that were clearly a formal declaration to all the assembled warriors. A sound rose from the hillsides, not war cries, but calls of acknowledgement and agreement. John's eyes burned with unexpected tears. He tried to express his gratitude, but words seemed inadequate. The chief seemed to understand. He clasped John's shoulder once, nodded with respect, and then returned to his horse. The girl rode forward and, with a shy smile, returned John's canteen. She'd filled it with fresh water from a hidden spring, water that tasted sweeter than any John had ever known. As quickly as they'd appeared, the warriors departed, flowing up and over the hillsides like water. Within minutes, John was alone again in the desert silence, the necklace around his neck the only proof that the extraordinary encounter had been real. John Mackenzie lived on that ranch for another 30 years. True to the chief's word, he was never troubled by Apache raids, even during the worst years of the conflict. Other ranchers whispered that he'd made a deal with the devil or that he was secretly supplying the Apache with weapons. John never corrected these rumors, never showed anyone the necklace, and never told the full story of what had happened that morning. He knew that some acts of mercy transcend the boundaries of war, that humanity persists even in the darkest times, and that sometimes doing the right thing, even when it seems foolish or dangerous, can change everything. One cup of water, offered without expectation of reward, had built a bridge across a canyon of hatred and saved not just one life, but potentially many. Years later, when the Apache wars finally ended and the tribes were forced onto reservations, an old Apache man appeared at John's ranch one final evening. He was accompanied by a woman John recognized, now grown with children of her own. The old man, the chief, was dying. He'd come to return the canteen one final time and to tell John that the debt had been paid in full, though the friendship would last forever. They shared a meal as the sun set over the desert, three people who'd found humanity in an inhuman time, proof that mercy is never wasted and kindness is never forgotten.